During the American Great Depression of the 1930s, jobs disappeared overnight, money grew scarce, and finding food became a daily struggle for many Americans. Families relied heavily on backyard gardens, planting staples such as potatoes, beans, tomatoes, and corn. These simple crops filled pantries, were canned for the winter, and stretched meals when there wasn't much else to go around. But even the best gardens couldn't cover every need. People turned to the land beyond their fences. They foraged in fields, roadsides, abandoned lots, and forests, gathering wild plants that had nourished generations before them. Today, we're looking at 10 wild plants that help families make it through those lean years. Let's start with one of the most important greens of the Depression, the humble dandelion. Back then, dandelions weren't just tolerated in lawns, they were a common kitchen staple and had been for centuries. Families picked the young leaves for salads and sautéed greens, dug the roots to roast as a nutritional coffee-like drink, and even made dandelion wine from the flowers for a bit of cheer in hard times. Rich in vitamins A, C, and iron, the so-called weed was a reliable way to get nutrients when fresh produce wasn't available. After World War II, as suburbia spread, lawn culture turned the dandelion into a villain. What had long been food became enemy number one in the quest for a perfect green lawn. Chemical companies seized the moment, pushing herbicides, and almost overnight, dandelions went from dinner plate to problem. The irony is, the very plant people worked so hard to kill off was only a few decades earlier a lifeline during one of America's toughest eras. But with grocery prices climbing and tariffs pushing food costs even higher, we may see the dandelion make its way back into American kitchens once again. During the Depression, lamb's quarters, sometimes called wild spinach, was a go-to green for families who needed something nutritious that grew abundantly and cost nothing more than the time to harvest it. Its leaves were tender when young, packed with vitamins A, C, calcium, and iron, and could be cooked like spinach or added raw to salads. Lamb's quarters was a nutritional powerhouse that stretched meals when store-bought greens were out of reach. People even canned it for winter use, treating it like a dependable staple in the garden even though it often grew completely wild. Today, it's largely overlooked and sometimes dismissed as a weed growing in empty lots and along fence lines. But with rising grocery prices and a renewed interest in foraging and homegrown nutrition, lamb's quarters is making a comeback, proving that some of the simplest wild foods are also some of the most resilient. Purslane is a little succulent plant that many Depression-era families relied on. It grows low to the ground, often in gardens, empty lots, or along roadsides, and its leaves and stems are rich in vitamins, minerals, and omega-3 fatty acids. In fact, it's one of the few terrestrial plants that contain significant amounts of omega-3. During hard times, people added purslane to salads, soups, or stews to stretch meals and boost nutrition. Its slightly tangy, lemony flavor made it a surprisingly pleasant addition, and because it grows so easily, often popping up as a weed in gardens, it can be harvested in quantity without much effort. Tumbleweed is often remembered as a Hollywood Western prop, rolling across empty plains in movies and TV shows. But during the Great Depression, it served a very practical purpose. Young tumbleweed greens were foraged for soups and stews, adding flavor, bulk, and essential nutrients like vitamins A and C, calcium, and iron to meals when fresh vegetables were scarce. Although not native to the U.S., these hardy plants thrived along roadsides and open fields, making them an easy-to-find resource for families trying to stretch limited food supplies. They couldn't replace a full garden, but tumbleweeds provided tender young greens and roughage that supplemented the diets of many Americans in the western U.S. during hard times. If you're enjoying this journey through the forgotten wild foods of the Great Depression, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in America's edible history. The Great Depression featured a lot of tubers as essential survival foods. Prairie turnips, Jerusalem artichokes, and other starchy roots were hardy, filling, and grew in the wild or semi-cultivated plots. Families boiled, mashed, or roasted them to stretch meals and add much-needed calories when meat and other staples were scarce. Tubers were more than just sustenance. They stored well, could be harvested over time, and provided reliable nutrition when other crops failed. For many households, these humble roots were a cornerstone of daily survival, showing once again how people relied on both cultivated gardens and wild landscapes to endure hard times. An empty plot wasn't an eyesore during the Depression. It was a source of nourishment. Stinging nettles grew wild in many of these spaces, and families learned to harvest them carefully, boiling or steaming the leaves to remove the sting. Packed with iron, calcium, and protein, nettles were a valuable green added to soups, stews, and even teas to help stretch limited food supplies. Though harvesting required caution, nettles were abundant and dependable, demonstrating how people turned overlooked corners of their neighborhood into sources of sustenance and survival. If you've ever sat under an oak tree dropping acorns in the fall, you know that they are more than abundant. During the Great Depression, families harvested acorns as a starchy, filling food source. After leaching to remove tannins, acorns could be ground into flour for breads, added to porridge, or even used as a thickener in soups and stews. Acorns provided calories, fiber, and minerals at a time when every bit of sustenance mattered. It was an easy harvest the whole family could take part in, a practical contribution to the household pantry. My earliest exposure to wild foods was huckleberries and dewberries. I learned it from my mother, who learned it from her grandmother, who lived through the Great Depression. Wild berries were a welcome treat during lean months, sweet, nutritious, and easy to gather. Families would pick them by the handful, eat some fresh, and save the rest for jams, preserves, and pies. Berries provided vitamins, antioxidants, and a morale boost when food was scarce. Common finds included huckleberries, dewberries, blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, wild strawberries, and cranberries, depending on the region. They were a small joy in difficult times. Milkweed isn't just for butterflies. During the Great Depression, families learned to harvest young pods, shoots, and leaves as a food source. The pods were boiled and drained, often twice, to remove bitterness and toxins, then cooked like a vegetable and added to soups and stews. Young shoots and leaves could be prepared the same way, offering another source of nutrition when fresh produce was scarce. You may notice that several of these wild foods require special preparation before they can be eaten safely. Acorns needed leaching to remove tannins, milkweed pods and shoots had to be boiled to remove bitterness and toxins, and even some tubers required peeling, cooking, or repeated rinsing. The extra effort shows just how tenacious families and communities were in these hard times. While some wild foods require extra steps to make them safe or palatable, others added flavor and nutrition with far less effort. Wild onions, garlic, and ramps grew abundantly along fence lines, woods, and empty lots, and families used them to season soups, stews, and vegetable dishes. A handful of chopped ramps or wild onions could transform a simple meal, providing vitamins, minerals, and a touch of culinary creativity even in lean times. When hard times hit, people turned to one another and to the land around them. During the Great Depression, survival wasn't just about what grew in the garden or what could be foraged. It was about sharing, teaching, and supporting one another. Communities came together to trade, cook, and harvest, and in doing so, they also reconnected with the natural world. These wild plants, dandelions, lambquarters, purslane, tumbleweed, tubers, stinging nettles, acorns, berries, milkweed, and wild onions weren't just food. They were lessons in resilience, resourcefulness, and the abundance of the land. In remembering them, we see how community and nature can sustain us even in the toughest of times. If you enjoyed this journey through the wild foods that helped families survive the Great Depression and may help us survive the next, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss future videos about foraging, food sovereignty, and community resilience. Share this with friends who care about edible landscapes and the power of nature to sustain us. Until next time, eat the weeds.